sit down with local historian Chris Sterner for a journey into the city's past long before incorporation and modern development. Chris brings to life the early days of the region, from Native American presence and turpentine docks to stories behind some of our street names that many residents drive past every day. Through rich detail and thoughtful reflection, Chris helps us understand the roots of Northport and the legacies that still echo through the community today. Whether you're a lifelong resident or new to town, this is an episode that brings hidden history to the surface. Hi, Chris. Thanks for being here today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
So I'd love to know what inspired you to study history in this area?
Well, my interest in history started probably back in 1974-75. I went to an event which was a reenactment of Revolutionary War living. It wasn't a battle or anything like that. And it just got me. It got hooked into reenacting. So I joined a group of reenactors. That started my research into history. How can I be accurate portraying things in colonial history? And from there, we went through 7 years of reenacting the Revolutionary War, from the Battle of Princeton and Trenton to Yorktown. Attended innumerable battles for those 7 years. Almost every weekend we had something to do. So you can see I got somewhat interested in history. In 1980, I had the opportunity to move to Florida and work for a utility up in St. Petersburg, and moved to St. Petersburg. And anytime I move into a new area, I like to research the history of that area, which I did when I moved to St. Petersburg. Of course, that's been researched to the nth degree, so my research was kind of minimal there. Eventually had to move to Spring Hill, Florida, and I did research up there. That primarily was Civil War, and I'm not a Civil War buff, so even though I'm interested in history, there are certain things that I don't delve into deeply. Eventually, I retired from, I worked in a nuclear utility.
Wow.
In Crystal River, Florida, but that was not my love. That was my vocation, not my avocation. My love for history took over. And to back up a little bit, while I lived in St. Petersburg, I attended Eckerd College and got my bachelor's degree in history and political science. I was on a roll, so I said, okay, it's time to go to graduate school. And I applied to and was accepted at the University of South Florida. My program was in history, concentration in civil rights history, but I still like the history of the land. So coming forward again, we moved to Northport in 2004. It didn't take me long to get involved in history because that was the year that Hurricane Charlie hit. I applied for a job with Edison College down in Fort Myers. Hurricane Charlie, some of the professors down there lost their homes, so obviously they weren't going to stick around. I was called, and I got a job teaching history in Fort Myers. So I taught history at Fort Myers for 3 years and then moved up to Punta Gorda and taught there for 2 years, so a total 5 years of teaching history. In 2008, it might have been even before that, my wife met a woman whose husband lived in the area for quite a while, back around the time that Northport was actually consolidated into a city, 59-60. He told me about, and this will be one of the things I discuss here, this turpentine dock, and turpentine, what he thought was a still. So I did a little more investigating there. He told me where it was. My wife and I went out there. I took pictures of it. I came home. I looked at what they said. What he said was the still. It matches perfectly a picture of a still, but this is only the base of the still, and it was a still. Turpentine dock, people question it because the Monacahatchee Creek is not very wide today. But in the 1920s, when the turpentine stills were pervasive throughout Northport, A.C. Frizzell, I'm getting into now the history of Northport. A.C. Frizzell, back in the 19 teens and the 1920s, actually purchased, ultimately, 100,000 acres in the Port Charlotte, Northport area. In fact, one of the pictures is an aerial picture of Little Salt Springs, and it actually says this is A.C. Frizzell's land. So he owned all this land. So they did do turpentine collection in the area, and they did have local stills, because most people say, well, they gathered all of this turpentine and all of this sap from the pine trees, took it somewhere and distilled it. That was impractical.
I was just going to ask you, what is a turpentine, Doc? So
it's impractical to convey all of this tar. I'll put it. It's essentially a tar. The things from the pine trees, you can't do that because it takes up too much space. By the time they distill, say, a barrel of pitch from the pine tree, you only get a couple of gallons of turpentine. So you can see it's easier to transport the turpentine than it is the tree sap. At any rate, so I did research on the turpentine dock, and I found nails from the 1920s, that sort of thing. It had to be a dock. There was no way. I was told by someone that, oh no, it was a bridge that went over the Mackhatchee Creek, and they drove cattle over the bridge. No, the dock on one side is, we'll say, at ground level. The other side is uphill. And I don't know if anybody's ever driven cattle. They don't like to go up wooden structures uphill, okay? So I discount that. That's just my historical, using some common sense. So I did some more research into it to find out about turpentine stills. I did everything I could to find out about the turpentine stills. So that's another. What I really am pushing for is to get an acknowledgement and a notification by, hopefully, the city that this is a historic site, okay? You cannot prove absolutely that this was a turpentine still, but there are certain things that in history you take for granted. We can't prove that the Greeks did certain things in Greece, but we know they did because they were there, okay? So it's like saying, well, how do we know that they had turpentine stills here? Because we know that A.C. Frizzell had turpentine stills, and that, I believe, was one of them. As I said, they were all over. Okay, one of the interesting things about A.C. Frizzell is he was a really sharp businessman. He started out as a telegrapher for the railroad that went from Boca Grande to Arcadia. And their office was at Murdoch. And Mr. Murdoch was the station master at that time. Ultimately, he sold the land to Frizzell. So Frizzell was the station master for a while, and he ultimately got into real estate and started buying up land in Charlotte County. And I probably ought to digress to Charlotte County, Sarasota County. At one point, they were all Hillsborough County. Okay, and if you go further back than that, it started out as Alachua County, then it went to Hillsborough County. Hillsborough broke up, and it was Manatee County. Manatee County ultimately broke up and formed parts of Sarasota County, DeSoto County, and Charlotte County. So you can see that there's a whole mess of records that you have to go through to figure out who owns what, was where. Fortunately, several good books, biographies, in particular Frizzell's biography written by his granddaughter or daughter, I'm not sure which one, at any rate. A book written about him explains just exactly how he bought all this land up and what he did with it. Again, he started out he actually rented out the land to certain corporations that did turpentine production. He did the turpentine. The trees, of course, if you do this for an extended period of time, the trees are going to lose their sap. They're going to die. Being the businessman that he was, what's next if you have trees that don't have sap? It's called lumber. He got into the lumber business. Wonderful. Okay, we just took all the trees out. What do you get into next? Cattle. So Mr. Frizzell was an incredible businessman, and he took advantage of what he had.
Was it Frizzell who sold the land to General Development Corporation?
I believe by that time he may have sold it to another company, and I'm still working on that kind of stuff. That's good. No, Mr. Frizzell had dealings with Weeks and Gorganius, which was a corporation which did a lot of turpentine and lumber, actually. So he may have sold it to them. Mm-hmm. I know at one point he rented it to them or leased it to them. And then eventually, I believe he sold it to them. Also, there was another company, the Miller Brothers, who were also into turpentining. So again, the records for that are probably somewhere this is about the time that Sarasota became a county. So finding the records for that is like, well, you have to go to Tampa. No, you have to go to Bradenton. No, you have to go to Sarasota. So I don't mind traveling around, but that's a lot of traveling around. So I'm basing a lot of this on the newspaper articles that were written at the time, and that's where I got that information. So my big thing, I suppose, is really trying to find out how interested everybody is in knowing this history that dates back to 18,000 years. And again, it's like Warm Mineral Springs and Little Salt Springs. That's something that's already been probably investigated to the nth degree. But it's these new, I call them new because to some people are old, but to me it's new stuff that happens in the 20th century. And again, since Northport was only founded in 1959, I'm interested in the fact that we need to find out what happened between 18,000 years ago and now. Or actually 1959, because Marshall Grove wrote a book on Northport from 1959 to the 60th anniversary or the 50th anniversary, 60th anniversary. And I'm not going to infringe on Mr. Grove's work, okay? There are some things that I know I could improve on, but I'm not going to. I think he did a good job. That's just me. Also of interest on the Myakkahatchee Creek is the fact that many prehistoric artifacts have been found in the creek, okay? And in 2012, the police here were investigating people that were pilfering things from the creek. My wife and I, when I explained that we went down to the creek in 2008 to really see what was going on there, to look at the turpentine still. And as we're walking into the woods along the creek, a gentleman was walking out with a bag full of things. And he bragged that, I have some mastodon bones, and I have some arrowheads, and I'm going to myself, oh my goodness. You have all that stuff. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people of Florida. And again, in 2012, I believe it was, I just read on that. The police here were trying to stop people from getting that stuff. It doesn't belong to anybody but the people of Florida. And again, this is another place that needs to be identified as a historical site. And if anybody knows anything about Northport, up at the Northport Environmental Park, there was a Native American village.
Really?
Okay. Yeah. The Native Americans that existed here before the Europeans came were the Timucuans. Okay, and there were two sub-tribes that were in this particular area, the Mogoso and the Osita. And they were here for quite a while. Of course, what happened after the Europeans got here, as most people know, it wasn't necessarily war that killed the Native Americans, it was disease. So those tribes kind of disappeared, along with the Calusa further south. It's like, well, okay, but they left things behind, okay? This is what I'm interested in preserving. A little history of the Native Americans, okay? They were here. Who came next? There's some thought that in about 15th century, early 16th century, Ponce de Leon had explored or wanted to establish a colony south of Northport. And they did some investigation in this area. In fact, the first person to see Warm Mineral Spring was Father Juan Ortez. In fact, the road leading into Warm Mineral Springs is Ortez Boulevard, okay? So Hernando de Soto may have been here. He did send Juan Anasco, one of his lieutenants, to find a landing site. Ultimately, they came through here. So, I mean, is there proof? No, we can only go on the records that existed, and these are Spanish records that were interpreted and included in another book by Mr. Williams. I don't have the title of that right off the top of my head, but again, another Spaniard came who actually explored the area between the Maaca River and the Peace River, which includes Northport. So Menendez de Avila is the gentleman that did that, and he did the investigation there. In 1819, and this is all kind of known history, Spanish ceded East and West Florida to the United States as a result of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Ultimately, in 1823, portion of Florida territory in which Northport is located was, as I stated before, Alachua County, and it stretched from, Alachua County stretched from west coast of Florida to just north of Fort Brooke or Tampa, and it was the county seat. During the Civil War, troops actually came through here, and one of the interesting facts that as I said, I'm not a really big Civil War guy, but one of the most interesting things I found out about the Civil War is Florida really hesitated to get in the side of the Confederacy. They were selling beef to the Union Army. Who had money? The Union Army. Confederates didn't have any money. Now, there were Confederates down here. That's a given. But for the most part, if most of the cattle people were selling their cattle to the north, I found that really interesting. Okay, so that pretty much takes care of the Maxahachie Creek and the people coming into this area. Actually, populating this area. And again, the records for land ownership back then are kind of nebulous because in 1835, the Second Seminole Indian War started, which really did involve our area, okay? Because probably not many people understand that the Seminoles aren't from Florida. The Seminoles actually were Creek tribes that originated in the Georgias and the Carolinas. They came down here because there was a lot of land and there wasn't anybody on it. And what were they getting away from? Because integrated with the Seminole, the Creek Indians were runaway slaves. And they got along great, okay? So they all moved south. And unfortunately, our government under Andrew Jackson decided that, we need the land for settlement. Okay, so in 1835, Second Seminole War starts. And if somebody asked me about the First Seminole War, that really didn't involve us very much at all. It was up in the Panhandle, and it was Andrew Jackson starting a war with Spain and with friends with the Native Americans. And it was like, that was a short-lived one to begin with. But the Second Seminole War lasted until 1842. And there was a lot of activity on the West Coast, in particular, West Coast of Florida, because of the cattle that were here and the fishing industry that was here, because there were Spanish fishermen that existed along this whole West Coast, and they would sell all of their wares to Cuba. Well, Cuba is supplying arms to the Seminoles. Wait a minute. How do we do this? So consequently, what happened is, and it sounds strange because I say Second Seminole War, and you think, well, there are armies on land. No. Most of the Second Seminole Indian War was fought by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard.
Wow.
Because they had to patrol the West Coast, off the coast, okay? They had a fort up in Tampa. They had probably their headquarters up in Tampa. But that whole war was basically fought by the Navy. The Navy sent people into Peace River, went up to Peace River looking for Seminole villages, and they would destroy the villages. And some of those expeditions actually came through Northport. So, and that is information I got from the naval records of that time period, which I got a copy of the records. So I know they were in this area. Okay, I get a large history lesson there. What I want to move on to is I pretty much discuss why I really want the Maxahachie Creek looked at by the city to try and figure out how can we make this a safe place for archaeology, history, and also identify it as these were places that existed before Northport was a city. Another interesting place we have in Northport is the railroad I mentioned that went from Punta Gorda to Arcadia. A portion of that goes through the southeast portion of the city, down near Yorkshire and Hillsborough. Actually, Hillsborough is the county line, so it cuts across Hillsborough, goes through past Yorkshire, and there's another road in there. And I got interested in this, and because I was looking at old maps, and these old maps are saying, wait a minute, there's a little town in there. And I went, no, there couldn't be a town in there. There was a town on the route named Eveland. And I wasn't sure if it was in Charlotte County and again, county lines, people try to delineate county lines as, oh, it's right here, it's right there. Back then, county lines were wherever the people thought the county line was. So this railroad track went through this section of Northport, and looking at the map, my wife and I actually took a Sunday and decided we're going to try and find out where this thing goes, because it's only, I would say it's less than 10 miles. It's probably in the neighborhood of 7 miles to 8 miles. We started at one end of where this, because the railroad bed's still here. That hasn't gone. In the 1970s, they took the tracks and the ties up, but they didn't remove the bed. It's a flat. It looks like a road, but it's the railroad bed. I know that because that's where the maps show the railroad bed. So we walked this entire thing looking for this little, it was a turpentine camp, and it was also a loading dock for cattle and lumber and turpentine and phosphate. So it exists somewhere. But we could not find any proof of where it was. And, of course, with the construction that's gone on along Veterans Highway, heavens knows where it's at. But the fact that railroad went through there, and I do have a document that says Eveland existed, it gives pretty much a good positioning of where it might be. And again, I believe it was in Northport. And again, this is stuff that needs to be looked at by the city and say, is it worth putting any kind of notation up there that says, okay, or some kind of plaque that, yes, there was a dock here that was part of the Charlotte Harbor and Northern Railroad stop between Punta Gorda and, no, not Punta Gorda, Boca Grande. I'm sorry, I keep saying Punta Gorda. It's Boca Grande and Arcadia. The last one I really need to talk about, and this comes into current history, okay? When I say current, I mean since the founding of Northport. The original City Hall, police station, government buildings is in Biscayne Plaza. That should be noted as the original governmental offices of the city of Northport. And again, trying to push that I don't need a whole lot of information on. There are pictures in Mr. Grove's book that show Biscayne Plaza. And one of the sources I got for that information was from Joan Morgan, because she's been around forever. And she says, yeah, that's where everything came out of at the time. And there are so many buildings, okay? Originally, when I first moved to Northport, I got on the Sarasota County Historical Commission and the Sarasota County Historic Preservation Board. It's two different organizations. One deals with, we're going to preserve houses. This is how you have to do it. And it was pretty stringent on what the requirements were to do that. The Historic Commission was tasked with putting up signage for, if this was a historical site, you put up a sign, okay, noting that that's a historical site. So I was familiar with all of that. Now what I'm trying to do is get that into the city of Northport and make them a big city like other cities and denote the history that most people don't know about, okay? As I said, I've got pictures of turpentine still, and if you look at the pictures of the turpentine still base, and it looks like the turpentine still base, I don't know how anybody can really refute that, okay?
We talked a lot about turpentine. What is the significance of that?
Okay, in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly, in the early 20th century, naval ships used turpentine in sealing the ship, in coating the decks, in many things, okay? Turpentine can be distilled and burned as any kind of fuel. So it was used primarily, in fact, they called turpentine naval stores because it was used by the Navy, okay, in the maintenance of their ships.
So before Northport was created as a city, what was the land like? Was it swampy? Was it dry?
For the most part, it was, we'll say, soggy, but it was wooded. I mean, a lot of pine trees. And again, this is why turpentine production was readily available. The whole southeast portion of the United States, that includes Georgia and the Carolinas, maybe even into Mississippi and Alabama, had lots of pine trees. And again, the Navy needed turpentine for maintenance of their ships, and this was the place to get it. And then we went through, and again, as I explained, we went through this, we decimated the pine trees because we're collecting all this turpentine. And what happens next is, well, the trees are dead. You're going to use the trees for something else. Mr. Frizzell figured that one out. Okay, so we took care of the wood. What's left? Scrub land. And actually, I can see some of that if you go over to the area around Biscayne Boulevard and Price, and if you look at the land there, and there's very few trees, okay? That's what I picture. And there are some pictures, the aerial pictures I mentioned before that were taken of Mr. Frizzell's land. There are pictures where the land is completely devoid of any tall plants, trees, or anything. That's when the cattle came in, and we had cattle land. So it went through an evolution of a lot of pine trees to a lot of no trees.
So where do our heritage oaks and pine trees or palm trees come in?
And again, I mentioned a book that is really good to reading, which I read in graduate school. It's called The Columbian Exchange. And it explains how things came to this country. And if you extrapolate from how things came to this country, you can see how things came from other areas to Northport. Say with a oak tree. Birds eat oak seeds. What happens when the birds come here? They deposit the oak seeds, and we have oak trees.
Sorry, I was trying to get you to say that.
I was trying to be courteous here.
Thank you. One of the last things I'd love to hear about are our street names. Some of them are pretty unique. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes. Having done research into General Development Corporation and how they were starting to name streets was interesting because a lot of streets are named after their relatives, their husbands, their wives, their kids, things that they experienced in life. One in particular, and one of the major highways or roads in our city, is Toledo Blade. And ironically, Toledo Blade was named after a newspaper in Toledo, Ohio, which did a lot of advertising for the Mackle brothers, who had part of General Development Corporation. They had done a lot of advertising, news blitz, in that newspaper, and they named Toledo Blade for the newspaper. And there are a lot of other roads. I'm not sure that everybody knows why Tamiami Trail is Tamiami Trail, because Tamiami Trail was originally designed to go from Tampa to Miami. Miami. Tamiami. So there's Tamiami Trail. And I hope that satisfies everybody's curiosity.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, so much for all of your knowledge and for sharing that with us today.
It was my pleasure, and as I've said before, and many times in front of many people, I will impart as much as I know and try not to go over what I don't know. Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of Voices of Northport. A heartfelt thank you to Chris Sterner for taking us back in time and sharing the rich, often overlooked history that laid the foundation of the city we know today. If you or someone you know has a story to share, reach out to us at communications@northportfl.gov. Until next time.